I saw them switch your wine. Waitress's daughter caught them swap poison wine. Tells Mafia boss. I saw them switch your wine. 6 words whispered by a 6-year-old girl. 6 words that would freeze the most feared man in the city mid-toast and expose an assassination plot worth millions. But here's what breaks my heart and what makes this story so powerful. That little girl wasn't supposed to be there. She was the daughter of a waitress, hiding beneath a service station, trying to be invisible in a world of silk suits and deadly secrets. And those 2 men, trusted soldiers in expensive Italian leather, they never even glanced down at her. They thought no one was watching. They were wrong. This is the true story of how the smallest voice in the darkest corner became the loudest warning. How a child's honesty saved a mafia boss from his own trusted circle. And how one whispered truth changed everything. Not just for a criminal empire, but for one man who'd forgotten that loyalty could still exist without a price tag. Stay with me because what happens next will remind you why the purest form of courage can be found in the smallest voice, even when you're terrified, even when you're powerless, even when the monsters around you have forgotten you exist. This is Arya's story, and it starts in the most dangerous place imaginable. Before we begin, please take a moment to support this channel by clicking the like, share, and subscribe button so you can keep enjoying awesome stories like this. Thank you. Let me tell you a story that will shake your understanding of loyalty and fear. It's about a little girl named Arya, just 6 years old, who saved the life of one of the most dangerous men in the city. And she did it with just 1 sentence. This happened on the evening of October 14th, 2025, in a place called the Velvet Hand. Not the kind of restaurant you'd find in guidebooks. This was the kind of establishment where reservations weren't made by phone, where the prix menu cost more than most people earned in a month, and where conversations happened in hushed tones because words had consequences. The Velvet Hand sat on the corner of 5th and Meridian, its windows tinted black, its entrance guarded by men whose tailored suits couldn't quite hide the shape of what they carried beneath. Inside, everything was calculated perfection. Burgundy velvet booths, crystal chandeliers casting amber light across white linen, and servers who moved like ghosts, appearing only when summoned, invisible when not needed. But the Velvet Hand wasn't really a restaurant. Not in the way that mattered. It was a front, a beautiful, expensive front for the operations of Malik Jaroslav, a man whose name was whispered with equal parts reverence and terror. Within these walls, deals were brokered, territories negotiated, and fates decided over wine that cost thousands and steaks that melted on the tongue. Arya didn't belong there. Not really. She was the daughter of Cora Udina, a single mother who worked the evening shift, balancing trays and biting her tongue when powerful men spoke to her like she was furniture. Cora was one of the few legitimate employees at the Velvet Hand, a waitress who needed the money desperately enough to ignore what happened in the private dining rooms, to forget the faces she saw, to pretend she noticed nothing unusual about cash-filled envelopes and men with hard eyes. Life wasn't easy for them. Cora worked doubles when she could get them, counting every dollar, stretching every meal. But she never complained, not to Arya. Instead, she taught her daughter something simple but powerful: keep your eyes down, your voice quiet, and never, ever draw attention to yourself. In their world, invisibility was survival. That particular evening, Arya's regular sitter canceled at the last minute. Cora had no choice but to bring her daughter to work. She begged the floor manager, a stone-faced man named Victor, promising that Arya would sit quietly in the service station and wouldn't cause any trouble. Victor had reluctantly agreed, but his warning was clear: the child stays hidden, especially tonight. Mr. Jaroslav was hosting an important meeting. Cora tucked Arya beneath the service station in the back corner of the main dining room, behind the hanging linens and beneath the counter where spare napkins and silverware were stored. It wasn't comfortable, but it was out of sight. Arya sat there in her favorite yellow dress, the one that reminded her of sunshine, her small legs pulled up to her chest. She promised her mama she'd be good, that she'd be a shadow, that no one would even know she was there. But being invisible is hard when you're 6 years old and the world around you pulses with tension and danger. From her hiding spot, Arya could see everything through the gap between the tablecloths. She watched polished shoes click across marble floors, heard ice settling in crystal glasses, and saw her mother moving gracefully between tables, a practiced smile frozen on her tired face. The air felt heavy that night, charged with something Arya couldn't name but could feel in her bones. At exactly 9:45 p.m., the main dining room began to clear. Regular patrons were politely but firmly encouraged to finish their meals and leave. Within 15 minutes, the space was empty except for one table, the round one in the center, positioned beneath the largest chandelier like a throne beneath a crown. Then he entered. Malik Jaroslav moved through his own restaurant like a dark king surveying his kingdom. Even a 6-year-old could tell he was different from everyone else. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his black suit fitting him perfectly, tailored to emphasize power rather than hide it. But it was his tattoos that made Arya's breath catch. Dark, intricate designs crawled up his neck from beneath his collar, and when he removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, she could see more ink covering his forearms and the backs of his hands. Symbols she didn't understand, words in languages she'd never heard. His dark hair was slicked back, and when he turned his head, Arya caught the glint of a small earring. His face was what scared her most. It wasn't cruel or twisted like the villains in her storybooks. It was cold, empty, like looking at a frozen lake and knowing something dangerous moved beneath the ice. His eyes, pale and calculating, swept across the room, missing nothing. When his gaze passed over the service station, Arya held her breath and pressed herself deeper into the shadows. 4 men joined him at the table. Arya recognized 2 of them. Silas, lean and sharp-featured with silver threading through his dark beard, always stood closest to Mr. Jaroslav. Goran, broader and quieter, with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, usually positioned himself near the door. The other 2 men she didn't know, but they carried themselves with the same coiled tension, the same predatory stillness. Her mother appeared, moving carefully, pouring water into glasses without making a sound. Malik didn't acknowledge her presence, didn't even glance up. To him, Cora was invisible, which was exactly what kept her safe. Arya watched her mother's hands shake slightly as she served, watched her eyes stay fixed on the table, never meeting anyone's gaze. The meeting began in low voices, words Arya couldn't make out but understood were important. The tension in the room ratcheted higher with each passing minute. She saw money change hands, saw documents spread across white linen, saw Malik lean back in his chair, his tattooed fingers drumming a slow rhythm on the armrest. Then, at 9:55 p.m., something changed. Victor appeared wheeling a cart that held a single bottle of wine. Even from her hiding place, Arya could see it was special. The bottle was old, its label yellowed, and it sat in a silver bucket filled with ice. Victor announced in a reverent tone that this was the 1989 Barolo, Mr. Yaroslav's personal reserve, brought out only for the most significant occasions. Malik nodded, a rare flicker of something almost like pleasure crossing his face. This vintage, he told the men at his table, was older than some of their alliances. Tonight, they would toast to new territories and old loyalties. But then Victor was called away to handle something in the kitchen. He left the wine cart beside the service station, just feet from where Arya was hiding. And that's when she saw them. Silas and Goran exchanged a look across the table, so quick that anyone watching the meeting would have missed it. But Arya wasn't watching the meeting. She was watching the cart, watching the way the light reflected off the dark glass, watching because she had nothing else to do but observe. Silas stood first, casual, stretching as if his back was stiff from sitting. He moved toward the restroom, but his path took him past the wine cart. Goran stood seconds later, checking his phone, moving toward the kitchen entrance. Their paths converged at the cart, their bodies momentarily blocking it from view of the table. Arya watched, perfectly still, as Silas reached into the lining of his jacket and pulled out an identical bottle. Same age, same label, same silver capsule over the cork. His hands moved with practiced precision as he lifted the original Barolo from the ice bucket and slid it into his jacket. In the same fluid motion, he placed the duplicate bottle in the bucket, adjusting the ice around it so it sat at exactly the same angle. The entire switch took perhaps 5 seconds. Goran leaned in, pretending to examine the label, providing cover while also checking Silas's work. Arya heard him whisper, "Perfect. He'll never know." Both men straightened, adjusted their suits, and returned to the table, sitting down as if nothing had happened. The conversation resumed. The meeting continued. And sitting beneath the service station, Arya felt her heart hammering so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. She didn't understand everything she'd seen. She was only 6 years old. But she understood enough. Her mama had told her about the wine bottles at the Velvet Hand, how some of them cost more than their rent, how the men who came here treated them like treasures. And she understood, with the clear, uncomplicated logic of childhood, that switching something without asking was stealing. And stealing was wrong. But more than that, deeper than that, Arya felt something in her stomach, something cold and twisting. She'd watched these men look over their shoulders before acting. She'd heard the fear in their whispered voices. And she'd seen the way they'd smiled when they returned to the table, smiles that made her think of the fox in her storybook, the one who'd tricked everyone else. This wasn't just stealing. This was something worse. Minutes ticked by. Victor returned and presented the wine to Malik, showing him the label. Malik nodded his approval. Victor opened the bottle with practiced ceremony, the cork sliding out with a soft pop that echoed through the quiet room. He poured a small amount into Malik's glass for inspection. Arya watched as Malik lifted the glass, swirled the dark liquid, brought it to his nose. She watched him prepare to taste, to approve, to allow Victor to pour for the entire table. She watched as the glass moved toward his lips. And somewhere in that moment, something inside Arya snapped. The fear that had kept her frozen, the lessons about invisibility and silence, all of it crumbled beneath a simple truth her mother had taught her years ago, before the world became complicated and dangerous. Wrong is wrong. Even when you're scared. Even when you're small. Even when telling the truth might hurt you. Arya didn't think. If she'd thought, she would have stayed hidden. Instead, she moved. She crawled out from beneath the service station, her yellow dress bright against the dark carpet. The room was so focused on Malik and the wine that no one noticed her at first. She moved on hands and knees, her heart in her throat, until she reached the side of his chair. Malik still had the glass raised, about to take that first sip. The liquid caught the light, deep red like blood. And that's when Arya did the bravest thing she'd ever done. She reached up and tugged on his jacket. The effect was instantaneous. The room froze. Every man at the table turned. Cora, standing near the wall with an empty tray, went white as snow. And Malik Jaroslav, the most feared man in the city, lowered his glass and looked down. His eyes found her, and Arya's courage nearly failed. Those pale, ice-cold eyes pinned her in place, and for a terrible moment, she couldn't breathe. This close, she could see every detail of the tattoos crawling up his neck, could see the thin scar cutting through his left eyebrow, could see the way his jaw tightened as he processed the impossible sight of a child in his meeting. "What?" he said, his voice so quiet and dangerous that it made the air seem to vibrate. "Are you doing here?" Arya's mouth went dry. Her mama's face was a mask of terror across the room. Silas and Goran both had their hands hidden beneath the table now, and she was suddenly aware that she had stepped into something far more dangerous than she'd understood. But she'd come this far. And the glass was still in his hand. And wrong was still wrong. Arya took a shaky breath, rose up on her knees so she could reach his ear, and whispered the words that would save his life and change everything. "I saw them switch your wine. The one with the red label. They said you'd never notice." Malik Jaroslav froze. Time seemed to stop, the chandelier above casting fractured light across the scene below. In that moment, with a child's whisper still echoing in his ear and a glass of wine suspended halfway to his lips, the most powerful man in the criminal underworld realized that death had come wearing the face of loyalty. And salvation had arrived in a yellow dress. He didn't drink. He didn't move. He just stared down at this tiny girl, this impossible witness, and felt the ice in his veins that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with how close he'd come to his end. The glass remained frozen in his hand. And around the table, the men who'd planned his death began to realize that the one person they'd failed to account for, the one witness they'd completely dismissed, was about to tear their perfect plan apart. Because Malik Jaroslav had built his empire on one principle: trust no one. And he'd just been proven right in the worst possible way. But for the first time in his brutal life, someone had given him the truth with no angle, no leverage, no price attached. And that someone was a 6-year-old girl who'd been taught that invisible people still had voices. And that sometimes, the smallest voice in the room could be the one that mattered most. October 14th, 2025, 9:30 p.m. Cora Udina's feet were screaming. She'd been on them since noon, working a double shift because rent was due in 3 days and she was still $40 short. Her lower back ached with that familiar burn that came from carrying heavy trays and bending over tables for hours. But she kept her face neutral, kept her smile professional, because showing weakness at the velvet hand was dangerous in ways most restaurants never were. She glanced toward the service station where Arya sat hidden beneath the counter, practically invisible behind the hanging linens. Her daughter's blonde hair caught the light for just a moment before she shifted deeper into shadow. Good girl. Cora's chest tightened with guilt. Number 6-year-old should have to learn invisibility as a survival skill, but here they were. When Mrs. Chin had called that afternoon saying she had the flu, Cora had felt panic claw up her throat. Missing a shift wasn't an option. Not here. Not when Victor kept a mental tally of every infraction, every absence, every moment of unreliability. So she'd brought Arya, tucked her into that cramped space, and made her promise to stay silent. To stay hidden. To pretend she didn't exist. The main dining room had emptied 20 minutes ago, the last legitimate customers ushered out with polite firmness by men whose smiles never reached their eyes. Now only the center table remained occupied, and Cora felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees when Malik Jaroslav entered. He moved like violence contained in an expensive suit. 6'2", broad shoulders, every step deliberate and measured. His black hair was slicked back perfectly, revealing the intricate tattoos that crawled up his neck from beneath his collar, dark ink forming patterns that seemed to shift in the amber light. When he rolled up his sleeves to sit, Cora caught glimpses of more artwork covering his forearms, symbols and script in languages she didn't recognize. His hands, resting on the arms of his chair, bore tattoos across the knuckles and along each finger. But it was his eyes that made her hands shake when she poured his water. Pale gray, almost colorless, like winter ice over deep water. They were the eyes of a man who'd seen terrible things and done worse. Eyes that assessed, calculated, and dismissed in the span of a heartbeat. When his gaze passed over her, Cora felt like furniture, like wallpaper, like air. It was the safest thing she could be in his presence. 4 men joined him at the table. Silas, sharp-featured and silver-bearded, sat at his right hand. Goran, broad and scarred, took position near the door. 2 others she didn't recognize filled out the circle, all of them carrying that same coiled tension, that same predatory stillness. The meeting began, voices low and controlled. But Cora could feel it, the electricity in the air, the sense that something significant was happening. Money appeared on the table in neat stacks. Documents were spread across the white linen. And Malik leaned back in his chair, those tattooed fingers drumming a slow, steady rhythm that made Cora think of a countdown to something inevitable. From her hiding place beneath the service station, Arya watched the shadows move. She'd learned to track people by their shoes. The polished black Oxfords belonged to Silas, always gleaming, always perfect. The heavier boots with the scuffed toes were Goran's. Right now, both pairs were shifting, restless, moving in ways that didn't match the calm voices at the table. Silas stood first, his chair scraping softly against marble. He stretched, rolled his shoulders, said something about his back stiffening up. But Arya noticed his eyes. They weren't on the other men. They were on the wine trolley that Victor had wheeled in moments before, the one with the special bottle that sat in ice like a trophy. Goran's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, frowned at the screen, stood and moved toward the kitchen. His path took him past the trolley, past Silas. Their movements seemed casual, unconnected. But Arya had watched enough adults to know when they were pretending. At the table, Malik observed the room with those colorless eyes, missing nothing. Or so he believed. His entire life had been built on vigilance, on the understanding that trust was a luxury that got men killed. He'd learned that lesson at 16 when his mentor, the man who'd raised him after his father's murder, had tried to poison him over dinner. Malik had survived only because he'd noticed the slight tremor in the old man's hand, the way his eyes wouldn't meet his when he poured the wine. Since then, Malik had tasted every meal before his associates, rotated his security weekly, slept in different rooms of his penthouse on random schedules. He'd built an empire on paranoia, and paranoia had kept him breathing when better men had died trusting the wrong person. He'd promoted Silas 3 years ago after the man had taken a bullet meant for him during a territory dispute. He'd brought Goran into his inner circle after the enforcer had eliminated a rival family's entire leadership in a single night. These weren't just employees. They were the men he'd chosen, tested, rewarded. They were as close to trusted allies as his world allowed. And yet, even now, even with them, Malik's hand rested near his phone, his thumb ready to send the silent alarm to the guards outside. Even with them, he'd positioned himself with his back to the wall, his sight lines clear to both exits. Even with them, he'd had the restaurant swept for explosives that afternoon and ordered his personal food taster to sample the kitchen's prep. Trust no one. The mantra that had kept him alive for 20 years. Victor approached with the reverence of a priest presenting a relic. The 1989 Barolo, a vintage Malik had acquired from a collector in Turin who'd owed him a considerable debt. This bottle represented more than wine. It was a symbol of power, of his reach, of his ability to obtain the unobtainable. Tonight's toast would seal a merger of territories, a consolidation that would make him untouchable in the city's underworld. Malik nodded his approval, allowed himself the smallest flicker of satisfaction. The meeting was going well. The terms were favorable. By midnight, his empire would expand by 30%. He didn't notice Silas and Goran converge at the wine trolley. He didn't see the swift exchange, the identical bottles sliding from jacket to ice bucket. He was watching the documents, calculating percentages, planning his next 3 moves. Hit like if you think betrayal should never be rewarded. Only backstabbers won't. 9:58 p.m. Arya's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Silas and Goran move toward the wine trolley. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows beneath the service station, making herself as small as possible. Her mama had always told her to stay quiet when the important men were around, to be like a mouse, invisible and silent. So she held her breath and watched. Silas reached the trolley first. His movements were smooth, practiced, like he'd rehearsed this 100 times. He glanced back at the table where Malik was leaning forward, pointing at something in the documents, his attention completely absorbed by the negotiations. The other men were equally focused, discussing percentages and territories, their voices a low rumble that filled the dining room. From inside his jacket, Silas pulled out a bottle. Even from her hiding spot, Arya could see it was identical to the one sitting in the ice bucket. Same dark glass, same yellowed label, same silver cap on top. For a moment, she thought maybe he was supposed to have 2 bottles, that maybe this was normal. But then she saw his hands shake slightly as he lifted the original Barolo from the ice. Goran positioned himself beside Silas, his broad body blocking the view from the table. He pretended to examine the label on the wine trolley, his finger tracing the words, but his eyes kept darting toward Malik. "Hurry," he whispered, so quietly that Arya almost didn't hear it. Silas moved with the precision of a surgeon. The original bottle disappeared into the lining of his jacket, secured in what must have been a custom pocket designed exactly for this purpose. In the same fluid motion, he placed the duplicate into the ice bucket, adjusting it so it sat at the exact angle, tilted the exact same way. He even repositioned the ice around it, making sure the amount of the label showing was identical to before. The entire switch took 5 seconds. Maybe less. Arya's small hands gripped the edge of the tablecloth she was hiding behind. She wanted to call out, to tell her mama to do something. But fear paralyzed her. These weren't the kind of men you interrupted. These weren't the kind of men who liked little girls who saw things they shouldn't. "Perfect," Goran breathed, stepping back to admire Silas's work. "He'll never know." "Not until it's too late," Silas replied, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He straightened his jacket, smoothed his silver beard, and both men returned to the table as if nothing had happened. Their faces were calm, professional, betraying nothing of what they'd just done. At the table, Malik was signing one of the documents, his tattooed hand moving across the paper with authority. He looked up as his men sat down, nodded at them, and continued the discussion. He hadn't seen a thing. None of them had. The meeting continued, voices steady, money changing hands, power being redistributed across the city's underworld. But Arya had seen every second of it. And beneath the service station, in her yellow dress that suddenly felt too bright, too visible, she understood with the terrible clarity of childhood that she'd just watched something very, very bad. Something that made her stomach twist and her hands go cold. The wine sat in its bucket, waiting. And nobody knew it had been switched except the 2 men who'd done it and one small girl who wasn't supposed to exist. Victor returned to the wine trolley with the reverence of a man handling sacred relics. He lifted the bottle from its ice bath, water droplets catching the light as they slid down the dark glass. He approached Malik's table with measured steps, presenting the label for inspection like a sommelier in a Michelin-starred restaurant. Malik glanced at it, nodded once, and Victor began the ritual of opening. The cork came out with a soft pop that echoed through the quiet room. Victor poured a small amount into Malik's glass, just enough to test. The liquid caught the amber light from the chandelier above, deep red like arterial blood. Malik lifted the glass, swirled it gently, brought it to his nose. His eyes closed for a brief moment, savoring the bouquet. Beneath the service station, Arya watched with mounting horror. Her small body was rigid with fear, her fingernails digging into her palms. The glass was moving toward his lips. In seconds, he would drink whatever Silas and Goran had put in that bottle. And something terrible would happen. She didn't know exactly what, but she knew it in her bones the way children know things, with an instinct that hasn't yet been taught to doubt itself. Her mama's voice echoed in her head. Stay quiet. Stay hidden. Don't cause trouble. But another voice, deeper and older, whispered something different. Wrong is wrong. Truth matters. Even when you're scared. Malik raised his glass higher, preparing to toast. To new territories, he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. And old loyalties. The other men reached for their glasses. Silas and Goran lifted theirs with steady hands, their faces masks of calm. They were good actors. But Arya had seen what they'd done. Something snapped inside her. A thread of fear that had been holding her in place simply broke, and before she could think about it, before her rational mind could talk her out of it, she was moving. She crawled out from beneath the service station, her yellow dress bright against the dark carpet. The room was so focused on the toast that for a heartbeat, no one noticed her. She moved on hands and knees across the marble floor, her heart thundering so loud she was certain everyone could hear it. Malik was bringing the glass to his lips. Arya reached his chair and rose up on her knees. Her small hand reached out and tugged on his jacket, the expensive fabric rough against her fingers. The effect was instantaneous. Every person in the room turned. Time seemed to stop. Cora, standing frozen against the far wall, went white as death. The men at the table reached for weapons concealed beneath their suits. And Malik Jaroslav, glass suspended halfway to his mouth, looked down. His eyes found her, and Arya felt the full weight of his gaze. Those pale, ice-cold eyes that had watched men die without flinching, that had stared down rivals and enemies and traitors. They pinned her in place like a butterfly on a board. This close, she could see every detail of the tattoos crawling up his neck, could see the way his jaw muscles tensed, could feel the danger radiating off him like heat. What, he said, his voice so quiet and lethal it made the air vibrate. Are you doing here? Arya's courage almost failed. Her mouth went dry. Silas and Goran both had their hands beneath the table now, and she could see murder in their eyes. But the glass was still in Malik's hand, still inches from his lips, and she'd come too far to stop now. She rose up higher, standing on her knees, and leaned toward his ear. Her hands were shaking, but her voice, when it came, was clear and certain. I saw them switch your wine, she whispered. They said you'd never notice. Malik Jaroslav froze. The glass remained suspended in his tattooed hand. And in that crystallized moment, the most dangerous man in the city realized that death had walked into his meeting wearing the face of loyalty, and salvation had arrived in a yellow dress. Comment loyalty over fortune if you believe greed like Silas's always fails. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then Malik moved. The wine glass hit the table with a crack that made everyone flinch. Lock it down, he said, his voice like a blade sliding from a sheath. Now. The 2 men flanking the table moved instantly, weapons appearing in their hands as they positioned themselves at the exits. One pressed a button on his phone and Arya heard the heavy clunk of magnetic locks engaging on every door. No one was leaving the velvet hand. Not until Malik said so. His pale eyes swept the room, calculating, assessing. Then they landed on Silas, who'd gone very still, his silver beard unable to hide the sudden paleness of his face. Stand up, Malik said softly. Silas didn't move. His hand twitched toward his jacket. Malik was across the table before anyone could blink. His tattooed hand shot out and grabbed Silas by the throat, slamming him against the wall hard enough to crack the plaster. The older man's feet left the floor, his hands clawing uselessly at Malik's iron grip. The wine, Malik said, his face inches from Silas's. Where's the original bottle? I don't know what she's talking about, Silas gasped, his voice strangled. She's just a kid, she's confused. Malik's free hand reached into Silas's jacket and pulled out the bottle. The real 1989 Barolo, still cold from the ice. He held it up, let everyone see it, then turned his gaze back to Silas. The look in his eyes was beyond rage. It was the cold calculation of a predator deciding how slowly to kill. "Last chance," Malik whispered. "Who paid you?" Silas's resistance crumbled like wet paper. "Pavel," he choked out. "Pavel Volkov. He offered 2 million. Half up front, half when you were dead." The room went electric with tension. Pavel Volkov controlled the East Side territories, had been Malik's rival for 5 years. This wasn't just assassination. This was a declaration of war. "How?" Malik demanded, tightening his grip. "Poison," Silas gasped, his face turning purple. "Ricin derivative. Tasteless, odorless. You'd have been dead before midnight. We'd have blamed it on Pavel's people in the kitchen, started the war, taken over while the families were fighting." Goran stood suddenly, reaching for his weapon. He didn't make it 3 inches. One of Malik's guards put 2 bullets in his chest before he cleared the holster. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Goran collapsed, blood spreading across the white marble floor. Arya screamed and covered her ears, pressing herself against Cora, who'd rushed forward to shield her daughter. But neither could look away. Malik dropped Silas, who crumpled to the floor gasping. "Check the bottle," Malik ordered Victor, who stood frozen near the wine trolley. "Carefully." Victor's hands shook as he used a testing kit from behind the bar, kept for exactly this kind of situation. The chemical strip turned black within seconds. "Poison." "Confirmed." Malik looked at the substitute bottle sitting innocently on his table, the one he'd been seconds from drinking. Then he looked at Arya, still trembling in her mother's arms, her yellow dress somehow still bright in all this darkness. "You saved my life," he said, and there was something in his voice Arya had never heard from a man like him. Wonder. Confusion. Gratitude he didn't know how to express. Silas tried to crawl toward the door. Malik's boot came down on his hand, grinding it into the marble. "Pavel dies tonight," he said to his remaining men. "And Silas here is going to tell us every single detail of their operation before he joins Goran." The screaming started seconds later. "If you can't stand people who abuse trust, subscribe now, traitors won't." Malik's men dragged Silas into the back office, his screams echoing through the restaurant before the soundproof door cut them off. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Goran's body lay where it had fallen, blood pooling around him like a dark mirror. Victor had already called the cleaning crew. This wasn't the first time the Velvet Hand had needed their services. Malik turned to where Cora stood frozen, her arms wrapped protectively around Arya. The little girl's face was buried in her mother's uniform, her small body shaking. He approached slowly, and Cora instinctively stepped back, pulling her daughter closer. "Don't," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, Mr. Jaroslav, she's just a child." "She didn't mean to interfere." "She saved my life," Malik interrupted, his voice strange, almost gentle. He crouched down, bringing himself to Arya's level, though she still wouldn't look at him. "What's your name?" Arya turned her head slightly, one blue eye peeking out from her mother's side. "Arya," she whispered. "Arya," he repeated, tasting the name. He looked up at Cora. "How long has she been here?" "Just tonight," Cora said quickly. "My sitter was sick. I had no choice." "I'm so sorry. I told her to stay hidden. I promised she wouldn't be any trouble." "She wasn't trouble," Malik said, standing. He pulled out his phone, made a brief call, then pocketed it again. "She was loyal. More loyal than men I've known for years. Men I trusted with my life." He gestured toward the office, where Silas's muffled screams had finally stopped. "Men who took my money, my protection, my respect, and sold me to my enemy for a price." He looked at Arya again, really looked at her. This tiny girl in a yellow dress who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by speaking up. She hadn't asked for money, hadn't tried to negotiate, hadn't calculated the odds or weighed the risks. She'd simply seen something wrong and told the truth, even though it terrified her. In that moment, Malik saw something he hadn't allowed himself to see in 20 years. He saw the empire he'd built, and he saw it without him. Pavel would have taken over within a week, claiming Malik had died from a heart attack or stroke. His legitimate businesses would have been carved up, sold off, disappeared. His territories would have fractured as his lieutenants fought for control. The families who'd sworn loyalty would have scattered like roaches when the lights came on. Everything he'd built, gone. Because he'd trusted the wrong men. And the only person who'd saved him was a 6-year-old girl who'd been trying to be invisible. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His entire life had been about power, about control, about building walls so high that no one could touch him. He'd surrounded himself with killers and criminals, men whose loyalty could be bought and therefore could be bought again. He'd isolated himself in a fortress of his own making, and that isolation had nearly killed him. Arya had given him something he couldn't buy, couldn't threaten, couldn't take by force. She'd given him honesty without agenda, loyalty without price, courage without calculation. She'd given him truth. And that truth had saved his life. "You're done working here," Malik said to Cora, whose face went white with panic. He held up a hand before she could plead. "I'm not firing you. I'm protecting you. Both of you. By tomorrow morning, you'll have a new apartment, paid for. A monthly allowance that's more than you make in a year here. And security. My security. No one touches you or your daughter. Ever." Cora stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. "I don't understand." "Your daughter saved my life tonight," Malik said simply. "That's a debt I can never fully repay. But I can make sure she never has to hide under a service station again." By noon on October 15, 2025, Cora and Arya's entire world had changed. 2 of Malik's men arrived at their cramped studio apartment at dawn, professional and polite, helping them pack the few belongings worth taking. Cora kept expecting this to be some kind of trap, some delayed punishment for witnessing what had happened at the Velvet Hand. But the men were gentle with Arya, patient when she wanted to bring her stuffed rabbit and the worn picture book her grandmother had given her. The safe house was in a quiet neighborhood Cora had only driven through once, the kind of place where trees lined the streets and children rode bikes without looking over their shoulders. It was a 2-bedroom townhouse with actual sunlight streaming through clean windows, hardwood floors that didn't creak, and a kitchen with appliances that all worked. To Arya, walking through the door felt like stepping into a dream. "This is ours," she whispered, her small hand gripping her mother's. "For as long as you need it," the lead security man said. His name was Anton, built like a tank but with kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled at Arya. "Mr. Jaroslav has arranged everything. First month's expenses are already covered, and you'll receive a monthly deposit going forward." He handed Cora an envelope. "There's also this." Cora opened it with shaking hands. Inside was more cash than she'd ever seen in her life, along with a bank card and a letter on heavy paper. The letter was brief, written in Malik's angular handwriting, for the girl who saw the truth. "Use it well. There are guards," Anton continued, gesturing to the street where an unmarked car sat with 2 men inside. "They'll rotate shifts. You won't always see them, but they're there. No one gets near you or Arya without clearance. You're off the grid now. Safe." Cora sank onto the couch, overwhelmed. "I don't understand why he's doing this." Anton's expression grew serious. "Because what your daughter did last night changed everything. She didn't just save his life. She showed him something he'd forgotten existed." He glanced at Arya, who was exploring the townhouse with wide-eyed wonder. Loyalty without a price tag. Truth without an agenda. That's rare in Mr. Yaroslav's world. Worth more than gold. Over the next few days, Cora began to understand the full scope of Malik's gratitude. The bank account he'd set up held enough to cover years of living expenses. A lawyer appeared with documents ensuring Arya could attend any school Cora chose, all expenses paid. Medical insurance, dental, everything they'd been scraping by without was suddenly handled. Groceries appeared at their door. New clothes in Arya's size filled the bedroom closet, including 3 more yellow dresses, because someone had remembered it was her favorite color. But more than the money, more than the material things, was the separation itself. Cora would never have to return to the Velvet Hand. Never have to balance trays while pretending not to see violence conducted in whispers. Never have to teach her daughter that survival meant making herself invisible. Arya could just be a child now. Safe, protected, free. On the 3rd night in their new home, Arya stood at the window looking at the stars, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. "Mama," she asked quietly, "did I do the right thing?" Telling him about the wine. Cora knelt beside her daughter, pulling her close. "You did the bravest thing, baby. You told the truth when it would have been easier to stay quiet. That's always right." Outside, the security car made its rounds. Inside, a mother and daughter slept in real beds in separate rooms for the first time in years. And across the city, in a penthouse office, Malik Jaroslav looked at a photo his men had taken of Arya playing in her new backyard, and felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Purpose. Share this if you believe the truth will always come out. Don't side with the lies of Goran and Silas. 7 days after the night at the Velvet Hand, Malik Jaroslav arrived at the safe house unannounced. Anton had called ahead by 30 seconds, enough time for Cora to panic and try to make the already spotless townhouse more presentable. She needn't have bothered. Malik barely glanced at the interior as he stepped inside, his focus elsewhere. He found what he was looking for in the backyard. Through the kitchen window, Malik watched Arya play in the small garden. She discovered a patch of dirt near the fence and was conducting some elaborate game involving her stuffed rabbit, 3 sticks, and a narrative only she understood. Her yellow dress was smudged with soil, her blonde hair escaping from its ponytail, and she was laughing. Actually laughing, the sound bright and unrestrained in the afternoon sun. Malik stood there for a long time, just watching. Cora hovered nervously behind him, unsure if she should offer coffee or stay silent. She chose silence. "She doesn't know, does she?" Malik finally said, his voice quiet. "About what happened to Silas and Goran?" "No," Cora said quickly. "I told her they were bad men who went away. That's all she needs to know." "Good." Malik's tattooed hands rested on the windowsill, and Cora noticed they were clenched tight, knuckles white. She shouldn't know. Not ever. He watched Arya build a small fortress of sticks around her rabbit, declaring it safe from dragons. The simplicity of it, the pure uncomplicated joy, struck something deep in Malik's chest. When was the last time he'd felt safe? When was the last time anything in his world had been simple? The answer was never. Or so long ago he couldn't remember. His life was a carefully constructed prison of his own design. He lived in a penthouse with bulletproof windows and panic rooms. He ate food that was tested for poison. He slept with a loaded gun within reach and trusted no one enough to close his eyes completely. Every conversation was a negotiation. Every relationship was transactional. Every moment was calculated, measured, assessed for threat. And here was this child, playing in the dirt, building stick fortresses, believing in dragons and safety and happy endings. The contrast was devastating. Malik had built an empire on paranoia and isolation. He'd survived 20 years by assuming everyone wanted him dead and acting accordingly. That paranoia had kept him alive, had made him powerful, had given him everything money could buy. But standing there, watching Arya's innocent play, He realized with crushing clarity what it had cost him. Everything that mattered. He had no family, no friends, only assets and liabilities. No peace, only vigilance. No joy, only the grim satisfaction of surviving another day. He'd traded his humanity for power, and now he couldn't remember what being human felt like. But Arya reminded him. Her whispered warning had saved his life, yes. But this moment, watching her play in a backyard she didn't have to hide in, this was saving something deeper. Some part of him he'd thought was dead was stirring, painful and unfamiliar. "She's not going back," Malik said suddenly, his voice rough. "Not to that life. Not ever." "I know," Cora said softly. "You've given us everything. I'm not talking about money." Malik turned to face her, and Cora was shocked to see something almost like desperation in his pale eyes. "She's innocent. Pure. She saw evil and chose truth over safety. That kind of courage, that kind of goodness, it's rare. It needs to be protected." He looked back at Arya, who was now having her rabbit conduct a royal inspection of the stick fortress. "My world destroys things like her. It corrupts everything it touches. I need you to promise me something." Cora tensed. "What?" "Keep her away from it. From me, from all of it. Use the money, use the security, but keep her innocent. Let her believe in stick fortresses and safety. Let her grow up thinking the world has more good than bad." His jaw tightened. "Don't let her become what I am. Mr. Jaroslav. Promise me," he said, and there was something pleading in his voice that Cora had never expected to hear from a man like him. "I promise," she whispered. Malik nodded once, then walked to the back door. He opened it and stepped out into the yard. Arya looked up, startled, then broke into a shy smile when she recognized him. "You came to see my fortress," she said, proud. "I did," Malik said, crouching down. This close, he could see grass stains on her knees, dirt under her fingernails, life being lived without fear. "It's very strong." "It has to be," Arya explained seriously. "For the rabbits." "Of course." Malik reached out and gently adjusted one of the sticks, strengthening the wall. "Everyone needs a safe place." Arya beamed at him, and in that smile, Malik saw everything he'd sacrificed and everything he needed to protect. He stood, nodded to her, and walked back inside. At the door, he paused. "The security stays permanent," he told Anton. "I don't care what it costs. Nothing touches her." Comment: "I choose humanity if you think Malik should learn to trust the innocent. Only the truly paranoid will scroll past." 6 months later, April 2026. Malik sat in the back of his Mercedes, watching through tinted windows as children poured out of Sterling Academy's front doors. The private school occupied a renovated mansion on 3 acres of manicured grounds, the kind of place where futures were carefully cultivated and protected. He spotted Arya immediately, her blonde hair longer now, pulled back with a blue ribbon that matched her uniform. She was laughing with 2 other girls, her backpack bouncing as she ran toward where Cora waited by the gate. She looked nothing like the terrified child who'd hidden beneath a service station. She looked whole. Malik's phone buzzed. Territory report. Revenue projections. A potential problem with a shipment at the docks. The machinery of his empire continued grinding forward, relentless and profitable. But he didn't reach for the phone immediately. He watched Arya hug her mother, watched them walk hand in hand toward the car Anton had waiting. Watched them disappear into a life he'd made possible but could never be part of. And realized he was content with that. The past 6 months had changed him in ways his associates noticed, but didn't understand. Malik was still dangerous, still ruthless when necessary. The consolidation of territories had proceeded exactly as planned. Pavel Volkov's organization had been dismantled, its pieces absorbed or destroyed. The city's underworld answered to Malik now with even greater fear and respect. On paper, he was more powerful than ever. But something fundamental had shifted. He no longer saw betrayal in every shadow. He'd restructured his inner circle, promoted men based on demonstrated loyalty rather than calculated fear. He'd started eating meals without paranoia, sleeping without a gun in his hand. Not because he'd grown careless, but because he'd realized something crucial that night in October. Paranoia couldn't save him. Only genuine loyalty could. And genuine loyalty couldn't be bought or threatened into existence. Arya had taught him that. A 6-year-old girl with nothing to gain had given him everything that mattered. Not just his life, but a reason for that life to have value. Before her whispered warning, Malik had been building an empire with no heir, no purpose, no point beyond accumulation. Power for power's sake. Money for money's sake. Survival without anything worth surviving for. Now he had something to defend that wasn't just territory or assets. He had a connection, however distant, to something pure. Every month, Anton delivered an envelope with Arya's school reports and a few photos Cora thought he might want to see. Malik kept them in his office safe, alongside the documents worth millions. Sometimes, late at night when the city was quiet and his empire slept, he'd take them out and study them. Arya's artwork from class. Her spelling tests with gold stars. A photo of her at a school play, dressed as a tree, grinning. Evidence of a life untouched by his world, protected by his resources, but innocent of their source. This was wealth. Not the properties or the accounts or the power. This small connection to someone who'd shown him that humanity still existed, even in a world as dark as his. This knowledge that somewhere in the city, a child played and learned and grew, safe because he'd chosen to make it so. His business partner, Dmitri, had asked him once why he maintained such expensive security for a waitress and her daughter. Malik had simply stared at him until the question died. Some things couldn't be explained to men who'd never experienced them. Some debts transcended money. Some investments had no quantifiable return except the knowledge that something good existed in the world and you'd helped protect it. The Mercedes pulled away from the school. Malik finally checked his phone, responded to the urgent messages, returned to the business of being who he was. But something had changed in how he conducted that business. He was still the king of his dark empire, still feared, still dangerous. But now he had something to defend beyond himself. Now he had purpose. And that made all the difference. Malik looked out at the city passing by his window, the city he controlled through fear and force, and thought about a little girl in a yellow dress who'd whispered the truth when silence would have been safer. She'd saved his life that night. But in the months since, she'd given him something even more valuable. She'd given him a reason to believe that life was worth saving.